views and opinions expressed in this program are those of the participants and do not necessarily reflect the views of BronxNet or the program underwriters.
Hello, everyone, and welcome to another edition of the Social Justice Forums. I'm Daren, Jaime, and we thank you for joining us. If you're asking a question as to what the Social Justice Forums are about, well, we take a look at many of the inequities that people face. We talk about civic dialogue, civic conversation, and we promote multiple points of view. We have some exciting guests, exciting conversation, and we want you to stay tuned because the Social Justice Forums begins right now. Welcome back to the show. Our first guest is the first African-American woman to head an Episcopal Seminary. She's a renowned faith leader and expert on the intersection of the Black church and racial justice issues, including COVID-19's disproportionate impact on the Black community, as well as criminal justice reform. She is currently writing a book that's titled Resurrected Hope, or I should say Resurrection Hope, a future where Black lives matter. Joining me to share more now is the Dean of Episcopal Divinity School at Union Theological Seminary and Theologian in residence at Trinity Church, Wall Street, the Reverend Dr. Kelly Brown Douglas. And Reverend Brown Douglas, thank you so much for being with us.
Oh, thank you for having me, Pastor Jaime.
I'm glad to have you in this conversation. And as we talk really right now about where we are as a society, I think that your work and your writing really is paramount. And when we talk about COVID-19 and how it's really impacted the African-American community, and we're dealing with this Delta variant, share with me a little bit about your thoughts as to where you see things today.
Yeah, indeed, this question and this issue of COVID-19 and how persons, of course, began to say how COVID-19 revealed to many the inequities that were present in the African American community and other communities of color. It only revealed that to those who weren't living with them, right? Who weren't on the underside of these. So what I like to say is that we saw the convergence of two pandemics. One was the health pandemic, and one was this ongoing, much ignored pandemic of white supremacy, white racism that indeed created social, cultural comorbidities in communities of color, nothing more than the comorbidity of poverty, which brings along with it inadequate housing, inadequate employment, inadequate health care, all of those things that indeed have left Black people disproportionately vulnerable to COVID-19. And we've seen that. We expect the same thing, obviously, with the Delta variant. And so what we need to do is to understand that the vaccination for the disproportionate impact that COVID-19 and its various variants are having and will have on the African-American community is not simply about a shot in the arm. We must do that, but it is about changing our systems and structures in such a way that we can begin to dismantle those very things that have left Black communities and other communities of color in what I call a culture of death, communities that breed death, not life. And if we weren't aware of that before, then COVID-19 has certainly made us aware of that.
And talking right now, one of the issues that seems to come rising to the forefront right now is the conversation about critical race theory. A lot of people had that on the back burner, but now we know the critical race theory becomes another targeted thing. We know that some areas of the United States are trying to remove our nation's history, trying to get rid of critical race theory from amongst the dialogue. And so I want to get your perspective on critical race theory. But first, what I want you to do, spend just a second giving some education to some of our viewers who may not even know what critical race theory is really all about.
Yes, thank you for that question, because critical race theory is so much in the news and everybody talking about critical race theory. Most of those talking about it have no clue what it is about. It is also not new, right? And so critical race theory has been around for a long time, even if it's not been called that. I like to at least say it's been around since the time, and probably before, when W.E.B. Du Bois said in 1903 that the problem of the 20th century is the problem of the color line. And what critical race theory tries to do is help us really to understand all of those intersecting realities, beginning with a racially defined nation that has prevented the nation from living into its vision of itself, its best vision of a democracy where there is freedom and justice for all. So what I like to say is that critical race theory begins to look critically at the way in which race has impacted the nation's ability to live into its vision of itself.
And as we look right now, that conversation continues to go forward. Some people are still in the state of denial when talking about this whole matter whatsoever. But give us your perspective on how we can really better define our nation's history, and how do we change that? Because you're an educational institution, you're training graduate students and those who are entering into the world of church and ministry, and you want to be able to present a balanced platform. And we know that when it comes to talking about issues of race, it seems as though white theology and white supremacy still runs rampant, even in a place of theological education.
Yeah, that's exactly right, because what we have made normative is one particular gaze, one particular perspective on our history, on experience, on truth. And in so doing, what we have prevented ourselves from doing is, in fact, expanding our vision and expanding the possibilities for justice, expanding the opportunity to live into our democracy. And so it seems to me that critical race theory is that which is significant and essential to us ever living into our democratic vision. So now, what does that mean that we have to do? It seems to me, Pastor Jaime, that if we want to indeed figure out why there is a gap between who we are as a nation and who we want to be, where we are as a nation and where we want to be, between our democracy as we are and the democracy that we aspire to, then if we want to get there, then we need to at least begin to understand our democracy from the perspective of those people who have not enjoyed the justice and privileges of our democracy. And so it is because they're the ones who can most tell you what's wrong. Right. And they're the ones that when they begin to talk about justice, then we know we're on the road, as Martin Luther King said, borrowing from preacher Theodore Parker, then we at least know we're on the arc that bends toward justice. Because when we don't begin to engage from the perspective of those people on the underside of justice, then we too easily confuse justice with the privileges that come from an unjust society. We too easily confuse justice with white privileges in a system and structure that privileges those who are raised white.
Yeah. And so you take matters into your own hands, so to speak, because you're the author of a book that's coming out, and that's Resurrection Hope. And that really begins to speak to the issues, particularly of those in the African-American community, talking about how Black Lives Matter. Share with us a little bit about what was behind your writing of this book.
Yeah, thank you for that. This book is sort of an extension from a previous book that I wrote called Stand Your Ground, Black Bodies and the Justice of God. And in that book, you know, I affirmed the faith tradition that God is just and is on the side of particularly Black people as they fight for liberation and fight for freedom. And as Black people do that, they're fighting for the freedom of all. But, you know, when we came through this summer of COVID-19 and the way in which it was disproportionately impacting Black life, then with what seemed to be an upsurge of the virus of assaults, police assaults and other assaults on Black bodies, one begins to wonder whether or not Black lives will ever matter in this nation. And in fact, Pastor Jaime, it was my 28-year-old son who began to ask me those questions over and over again. And he said, Mom, do you really ever believe Black lives will matter? And then he said to me, I understand what you write, that God is Black and Jesus, the Christ is Black, in terms of understanding them on the side of Black people as they struggle for freedom. But he said, but that isn't doing us any good right now. And so this was my journey to try to understand, in so many respects, if my faith, I was more loyal to my faith than it was to me, right? Whether or not we could really begin to have hope in a reality and in a world and in a God where indeed Black lives would matter. So it's sort of coming from the crucifying realities of Black death and trying to find that resurrection hope that will indeed affirm Black life in a nation that lets Black people die.
Yeah. And when we talk about really that gospel, the Bible, I know that you come from the perspective of understanding that much of what is written in the Bible from Jesus Christ on talks about really dealing with issues of poverty, the poor, the disenfranchised, the blind, those who have needs. And that seems to carry out in American society. We have people who are consistently poor. We have people who are really homeless. We've got people with an education crisis. And these are things that are both secular and at the same time also spiritual. So share with us, as we are, in this community talking about, we're returning back and we're going back to, our jobs. We're going back to church. We're going back to all the places. And a lot of people talk about returning to this normalcy. But the fact of the matter is, for African Americans and people in communities of color, what's normal hasn't always been fair and it hasn't always been just.
That's right. Yeah, precisely right. And, this pandemic and the convergence of, if we will, two pandemics should have provided us with the opportunity to begin to do something new. Pastor Jaime, I'm sure you're familiar with this term Kairos, sort of Kairos time. This term that we use and is in the biblical witness, where we talk about it as sort of the right time, but it's a time of opportunity, a time of chaos and crisis, but a time where we like to say theologically, where God is fully present, a time where we can begin to understand that we are being called to something new, something different, a new just future. That should be our new normal. This talk of returning to normalcy, a normalcy that was toxic, a normalcy that was not life-giving, a normalcy of crucifying realities. We can talk about that. We have to begin to be guided by this more just future and not accountable to the present or to the past. And so in our return to normalcy, I think, this nation talks about doing a racial reckoning. Well, a real reckoning is about really trying to do something to change, to transform, if not dismantle, the systems, the structures, the ideology, the culture that is indeed brought us to this place where we have not created a society that is life-giving. And then let me say one last thing, and then I'll shut up on this. That we talk about returning to our churches. Here's the thing. To call ourselves church is indeed aspirational, because this injustice has happened on our watch. And so we cannot even return as faith communities to the way in which we used to do things. What we learned during this time is that being church is about more than being inside a building. And so we've had to look at new ways to live into what it means to, in fact, be church and to serve those people on the underside, to be accountable not to this present reality, but accountable to a more just future, and begin to create a society that gets us there.
How do we do that as you know, as an educator and one who is responsible for instructing students and leading the way of not just instructing students, but also professors to be able to lead and guide and direct them in a way that really addresses where we are? Because I think the whole point of the education system is to help us to understand a little bit about history, but then also the context of how we're living today. And when we look at how so many people are living today, a lot of people don't embrace that context. And if you're from a community of color, we've been living this context for a long period of time, but yet and still it seems as though the issues go unaddressed. So help me understand a little bit more. How do you make people from where you are become more woke? And then not just at the same time more woke, but at the same time more active, because you can be woke and still not be active.
No, that's exactly right. But then you aren't woke, right? You're just sleepwalking.
You're woke, but you ain't awake. How about that?
Yeah, I like that. You're woke, but you ain't awake.
Right.
And really woke people are getting on my nerves a little bit because they aren't awake. But I think, you know, this takes us, first of all, back to your first question about critical race theory, that we cannot expect, and borrowing from the words of legal scholar Richard Rothstein, we cannot expect the next generation to be better than our generation if we do not begin to tell the truth about our history and how we got here. Not only do we need to tell the truth about our history, but we need to tell the truth about our present realities. And again, we only can tell that truth if we understand it from the people who have been on the underside of the lies that we have told about ourselves. And so we really have to, I like to talk about being sort of proximate and really understanding the complex realities that have created this poverty and these situations of death. And so we in educational institutions, what I try to do and what we try to do is to help our students, if you will, to understand that they are learning not just for learning's sake. They are not just taking in knowledge, but indeed that the role, the luxury, it's a privilege, right? To be able to get an education and sit around all day and think. You have to be able to, you have to have your basic needs taken care of in order to sit around and think. And so we try to help them to understand that they are accountable to those on the outside of the institution, and that it's not knowledge for knowledge's sake, but trying to begin to critically engage so that they in fact can take that back, even in the communities in which they find themselves, to begin to create different kind of conditions of living. And so we always try to make sure that they have this dialogue between that which they may be studying and that of which most people, the conditions into which most people live their lives.
Yeah.
But I tell you, it all boils down to having the daggone moral courage to tell the truth.
Right.
And when we do that, things change. And that's why people in this country don't want to tell the truth.
Right. Well, to paraphrase, that's like translating book knowledge into street knowledge and applying it. How about that?
That's right. And how about starting with street knowledge and starting with the questions? Not, you don't come with the questions in your head. Come with the questions of the people who are struggling just to survive and make it.
Yeah, I want to talk about that for a minute, because there are some people who are surviving to make it, and there's a lot of questions that still remain unanswered. I want to tackle this particular issue right here, because we have a whole lot of people, particularly in New York City, who are living, fortunately, through this eviction moratorium. And so many people lie in the balance, because once this eviction moratorium hits, from my perspective, and you correct me if I'm wrong, I feel as though that we will see a rise in homelessness. I think we'll see even a more rise in the need for services. And if this eviction moratorium when it ends, there will be more of a collapse. And I don't think that too many people are really talking about the potential fallout that will happen after this is over with.
Oh, no, I think you're exactly right. But I think we are going about this and looking at this in all the wrong way. First of all, we had an opportunity during the time and where there was a moratorium on evictions. We had an opportunity as a nation to begin to ask ourselves, why are people not able to afford a place to live? No one says, I want to live on the street. People aren't living in these kind kind of conditions because they desire to. It's because they do not have equal access and equitable opportunity to housing and to employment that will allow them to have the kind of decent, life-giving housing. Here's a statistic that I heard on the news a couple of weeks ago, and that is that there is no state in this country where a person can rent a one-bedroom apartment if they are making minimum wage. Can't, and yet we won't even raise minimum wage. And so we have not created the conditions for people to live. And so eviction moratorium, we need a moratorium on the conditions and systems and structures that have forced people into these kind of situations where they are living on the edge of being homeless. So yes, we're going to see an increase in homelessness and more people on the street. And you know what that means? That means more kids on the street because there's more families. And we know that that's the case in a place like New York. To the number of families that each night find themselves in a homeless situation. And so an eviction moratorium, we need to have a moratorium on not allowing people the opportunity to have decent housing. And I don't know, well, I do know why this country during this period didn't take the opportunity to say that this is inhumane. There should be no one in this country that cannot afford a decent place to live. And so now we have this, we're going to lift the eviction moratorium. And what does that mean? We're going to wipe our hands of it and say the crisis is over. And we're just going to turn these people back out onto the streets. And we know that the people that are mostly impacted by this are, of course, disproportionately people of color, but more than that. And so it's all that you say is right. This is where faith communities and other religious communities and other activist communities have to raise their voices and have to protest until we don't have a need for eviction moratoriums, because we don't have a need for evictions.
Yeah, we talk about protests. One of the people that come to mind is the Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. and the fact that he led these protests where it talks about voting rights. And when we talk about the issues of King's Day, voting rights, unemployment, housing, income, these were the conversations that were had by King in the 60s. We're now in the year 2021. And in the year 2021, we're talking about voting rights, unemployment, jobs, housing. How distasteful is it that 50 years plus after the assassination of Dr. King, that we're still having these same conversations?
Yeah, see, you know, it's like the COVID virus. If you don't get to the root of the virus and the cause of the virus, then all it does is transform itself and change. And it usually is a stronger variant. We're back to the same thing here, telling the truth.
Right.
And we have this country, in as much, you see, as it has a vision of being a place where there's freedom and justice for all, where everyone can pursue life, liberty, and happiness. That was its vision. And it's a miracle that that vision emerged, though it was quickly compromised by its very foundation. And the country needs to understand and tell the truth about this. The way we are is the way in which we set our nation up to be, the way the founding fathers set it up to be. It is a nation that is founded upon a framework that is raced, a raced framework. It is founded upon an elitist framework, a classist framework. And so until we began to understand that, the race capitalistic model of this nation, well, things aren't going to change. And so, and that's what critical race theory and all those are trying to help us to understand. It's not about being un-American, it's about being most American. If being American is living into the vision that of our better angels, as Abraham Lincoln would say. So we have to decide what kind of nation we want to be. The nation of this vision that was fleeting, but it was there. Or this nation of our founding fathers and those early Pilgrims and Puritans who indeed were trying to create what they called then this Anglo-Saxon exceptionalist nation. Now, what do we want to be? And so we are that at this critical moment, and we'll see. The answer to that question has not yet arrived, has it? Or maybe it has. We'll see. But here we are 58 years later after Martin Luther King's I Have a Dream speech. It's coming up in a few days from at least this recording on the 28th of August. And King's dream is nowhere near reality. And so there's still a promissory note, as he said, that the nation owes its people of color and more.
Yeah. Before we go, I want to have an opportunity for our viewers to be able to put their hands on your books and your writings. How can they be able to do that?
Oh, thank you for that. Well, easiest access is through Amazon.com, and in which they can find my books, and the forthcoming book will be out in a month or so.
All righty. Well, Dr. Kelly Brown Douglas, we thank you so much for joining us and being with us here on our show, and we definitely appreciate the conversation.
Well, thank you.
All righty. Well, we want to take a quick break. We're going to continue the conversation. Don't go anywhere. We've got more here on the Social Justice Forums.
We know that people are dealing with the health crisis, but there's also a lot of food insecurity.
We're giving out healthy food options, and that's what's key here.
If you're a senior, you have a disability, they'll actually deliver meals to you.
The residents are anxious, they're worried, they're scared, they want to be tested.
When things were happening in our community and we couldn't get the help.
There's almost a presumption of criminality that attaches to your skin color.
The site will prioritize those who are at highest risk in the population.
If you feel symptoms and you'd like to visit one of these COVID-19 testing sites here in the Bronx, you may call the State Health Department's hotline.
Important to note about this site is no reservations are needed. This is a walk-in clinic.
A lot of us are out of work and looking for something to do.
We have the machinery and the skills to make large scales of these masks and gowns.
Take care of your people. It's going to go way further than we actually can understand.
Right now, employees like myself are just adjusting to the new reality.
When taking public transportation, don't touch your phone. Carry hand sanitizer and use it immediately upon leaving the bus or train. Avoid touching your face. If someone is coughing or sneezing, move away. Wash your hands with soap and water as soon as possible. Limit contact with poles. If possible, avoid rush hour. Don't eat or drink on public transportation. Keep your bag off the floor or other surfaces. Avoid directly touching turnstiles. Stay up to date with the latest from your local health department and CDC. you're struggling to afford your internet bills during the pandemic, there's a temporary government program that may be able to help. It's called the Emergency Broadband Benefit, and it provides up to $50 monthly discount on your broadband bill to qualifying households. Find more information about the program, including if you qualify and how to enroll, at fcc.gov/broadbandbenefit, or call toll-free at 833-511-0311. That's 833-511-0311.
Welcome back. The Drug Policy Alliance envisions a just society which the use and regulation of drugs are grounded in science, compassion, health, as well as human rights, in which people are no longer punished for what they put into their own bodies, but only for crimes committed against others. The organization's mission is to advance those policies and attitudes best reducing the harms of both drug use and drug prohibition, and to promote the sovereignty of individuals over their minds as well as their bodies. Sharing now is the policy coordinator at Drug Policy Alliance, Queen Adesuyi, and we thank you so much for being with us.
Thank you so much for having me.
And when we have this conversation talking about drugs and policy, obviously we know that that's a waging conversation and debate all the way from Washington to the Supreme Court, all the way here to New York State. We know here in New York State, we've seen recently the decriminalization of marijuana and legalization of marijuana use. And so share with us a little bit about your perspective when it comes to this and the issue of legalization of drugs and then also drug criminalization.
Yeah, so just to speak to the fact that, we've seen a historic uprising over the last year or so, and we've seen throughout the country and even globally what I would call, urgent calls for transformative change and justice. And I think the impact of the latest campaigns around policing and even around overdose and ending the war on drugs have really spoken to the fact that people are really starting to question what does public safety actually mean? And, what does the systems of policing actually offer to us currently? I mean, who's actually feeling safe under these current systems of policing? So for me, I think it's integral to actually take the several steps to end the war on drugs. And that looks like, legalizing marijuana. But beyond that, it actually looks like really removing criminal penalties for all drugs and drug possession broadly. Ending the war on drugs does not start and stop at legalizing cannabis, even though it is a really important first step. But I think even beyond that, it's really critical to see how New York was successful in its legalization effort through a racial justice perspective.
Yeah, and you talk a little bit more about the sovereignty of what people actually put in their own bodies and not really being able to be held legally accountable for that. Give us your grounds for that perspective.
So June of this year in 2021 marked 50 years since former President Nixon actually declared the war on drugs, declared drugs public enemy number one. And this campaign, this war on drugs, was never actually about public health. It was never actually trying to address a public health issue. It was a political strategy to try to decimate Black communities and the anti-war left. And we've seen 50 years later the impact of that. We've seen how the war on drugs has fed into mass criminalization. We've seen how it's really allowed for policymakers to ignore real issues like homelessness and housing issues, the lack of access to nutritious food in our communities, economic opportunities being bare in communities, educational issues. The focus has just been on drugs and drug use. And none of that focus has not actually bore a better public health outcome. The last place that a person who's actually struggling with addiction should be is a jail cell. So, our actual approaches to drug use is a public health issue. And I think it's important that we actually start to evaluate how criminalization is worsening public health. And it's really kind of the underlying reason why we're seeing such horrible and terrifying overdose rates, not only in the state, but throughout the country. And it's only been worsened by COVID-19. And I think it's going to be really critical to see policymakers reckon with that. And I think, this year marking the 50th anniversary, it gives us an opportunity to try to imagine what we want the next 50 years to look like. And the status quo is just it's not working for us. It's harmful, it's decimated whole communities, especially folks who are living in over-policed communities. Black and brown, Latinx, low-income folks have really bore the brunt of the war on drugs beyond cannabis, in its enforcement, in its lack of access and its barriers to access when people end up having a conviction, the lifelong consequences that come with having a drug conviction on your record. It's a matter of time that we actually just finally end this horrible way of approaching drug use. And then on top of that, address the harm that comes and has come with convictions. We really need a comprehensive shift in how we address drug use. And for me, that starts with, ending criminalizing people for ingesting drugs and for possessing drugs. And just one piece that I want to add in addition to that is really highlighting the work of neuroscientist and psychologist, Dr. Carl Hart out of Columbia University. His data and research is really understated when it comes to policy work, but the majority of people who use illicit drugs don't have problematic relationships with their drug use. They're able to live stable, functional, relatively functional lives. It's actually a minority of folks who use drugs, use illicit drugs, who struggle and who have substance use disorders. But when you focus and socialize people to stigmatize drug use in the way that we see it happening now, we're not able to actually focus on the minority of folks who need help. And we're not able to actually offer them a system of care that's not punishment, and that's not demonizing, and that's not waiving resources that are absolutely necessary to live stable lives in folks' faces. I think it's going to be critical for us to really end stigma and shift away from this fantasy of a drug-free world over to one that's actually grounded in reality and grounded in harm reduction, which I think will actually help us save lives.
Yeah, and I know you're a Bronx girl and you're from New York State, so talk to us a little bit about our state, because you feel as though that our state has done has been a great example of how things work. What is it that you like about New York State when it comes to the issue of handling the drug crisis and decriminalization?
I would say New York definitely still has room to grow, but I will say the campaign that ended up bringing us legalization is one that can help influence the country. And it's one that's mirroring the effort on the federal level through Congress. New York for a long time was the marijuana arrest capital of the country. We're the home to Rockefeller drug laws. We're really the home to a lot of harm when it comes to drug prohibition and over enforcement. And like you said, I grew up in the Bronx and I'm very familiar with how mass criminalization harms people, especially young people. And I think it was really important to see the Marijuana Regulation and Taxation Act pass this year because of its centering of racial justice and the fact that advocates on the ground have continued to never let up on the fact that we need restitution. It's not enough, it's insufficient to just end, marijuana prohibition now after decades of the way it's impacted people. To put it plainly, like people have lost their children because of proximity to the plant. People have been deported because of marijuana. People have lost their housing, their jobs. Like the harm that has been endured by individuals and families throughout the state and throughout the country is immeasurable. So this lens that we have in terms of ending marijuana prohibition, focusing on equity, making sure that people who have experienced criminalization of marijuana actually have an avenue to the legal market and are not shut out. All of those things are important and they're owed to our communities. So it's really important. I feel really grateful that New York was able to do legalization in this way, because not other states have not been able to do that. Previous campaigns were not as focused on racial justice as we saw in New York and campaigns right before it.
Give me your sentiments on this. We've got the criminalization of crack, we've got the criminalization of cocaine, and up until recently, the criminalization of marijuana use. But then on the other side, we do understand that we're living in the middle of an opioid epidemic. But when it comes to the opioid epidemic, it seems as though there's more victimization than there is criminalization. Your sentiments?
Well, it's funny you say that. I agree that at least in sentiment, policymakers seem to be more compassionate when it comes to the opioid and overdose crisis that we're currently experiencing. And that's mainly because the impact started to really reach suburban communities. It's impacted the children of politicians. The overdose crisis does not see class. But oftentimes that has not actually translated to policy change. So we need more than just compassionate sentiments. And of course, I wish that we can have the same compassion across all overdose crises, that are experienced across all of our communities. But compassion and sentiment is not enough. We need overdose prevention sites. We need aggressive harm reduction measures in place in New York and throughout the country. We need to actually end criminalizing people for drug use. Stop putting people in jail because they use drugs. And we want to be mindful that the world that we're envisioning, post the end of criminalizing people for drug use does not look like mandated and forced treatment. We don't want to swap out incarceration and jail for just forcing people into, treatment if they don't need it or want it. Like I mentioned earlier, the majority of people who use illicit substances don't even have substance use disorder. So what we really need to do is use all that money that we are putting towards enforcement of these failed drug laws and actually invest in communities and stop focusing on drugs. I think the drug war, again, has given policymakers permission to ignore the real issues. We can just demonize people for their drug use and ignore the other issues that they're dealing with that are systemic. Homelessness, poverty as a systemic issue, systemic racism as a public health issue. All of these things need to be addressed in order to actually get at overdose and get at broader harms of prohibition.
Can you share with us a little bit about the Marijuana Regulation and Taxation Act? It's MRTA, as some people know it. But from your perspective, you do believe that that creates an opportunity for what we call restitution and possibly even equity.
Yes, I think the MRTA did its best to try to speak towards those principles.
And let me cut you off, but I do want you also at the same time explain what the act actually is for our viewers.
Yeah, so the act is the legislative vehicle that brought legalization to New York. It passed this year after decades of fighting for this in New York. We saw through the end of criminalizing marijuana in New York State. I think the most important part of this bill and pieces of this bill is the way that it tries to bring forth restitution and acknowledge the fact that marijuana criminalization should have never happened and the way that it was enforced was wrong in our communities. So the MRTA includes things like protections for non-citizens. It includes housing and employment protections. It includes expungement. Includes a robust attempt at trying to increase and facilitate equity in the legal market that is born from the effort to legalize. It sets aside revenue from cannabis sales over to reinvestment for communities. It also marks off, like 50% of licenses for social equity applicants, which is meant to try to facilitate folks who have been marginalized to be able to enter the legal industry. There's a lot of lessons to be learned, and I think what advocates are dealing with is trying to build a plane while flying it. So of course there's going to be room to improve, but I think it's really critical that first and foremost the campaign was centered in the principles of wanting to get restitution and making sure that directly impacted New Yorkers benefit the most from legalization.
And when we talk about the legalization, obviously we do know that puts an end to the criminalization of people, particularly when it comes to marijuana and low-level marijuana offenses. We've seen mass incarceration due to that. What has been the word on the street since New York State has really made this move from what you're gathering from people that you work with?
People are happy. Again, this is just the first step. For us, this was long overdue. I think it should have never even taken this long. For me, when I reflect on the amazing work that happened in getting legalization done in New York, I think about Marley Graham. He was murdered when I was in high school, and that should have never happened. There's so many countless deaths that happened at the hands of police because, in the name of the drug war, that should have never happened. And unfortunately, those lives will never be able to come back, and justice is still never really going to be served because of the loss of those lives. But I think it's important to see, how legalization happened, again, through this lens of, acknowledging the harms that have happened across communities and wanting to make sure that people are able to actually benefit in the ways that they see fit.
Yeah. So talk to me about some of the work that you're doing right now.
In June, that marked the 50th anniversary of the war on drugs, we actually saw the first federal drug decriminalization bill introduced. It was actually introduced by Representative Cori Bush and Representatives Bonnie Watson Coleman from New Jersey, a neighboring state. And that bill, brings forth the first kind of legislation in Congress to allow for the conversation around what it actually means to shift away from criminalizing people for drug use and punishing people over to what it might look like to actually treat drug use as the public health issue it is. You know, shifting all of our funds away from enforcement over to investment into communities. That's one thing I'm working on. And I'm similarly on the forefront of marijuana justice reform in Congress, which is similar, and it's piggybacking off of the effort in New York to try to ensure that we actually can end marijuana prohibition on the federal level. And I think one important piece to remember in terms of our fight to actually end the collateral harms of prohibition is that some benefits won't really be actualized until federal criminalization ends. One piece that I want to highlight here is around protecting non-citizens. Non-citizens across the country, even in legal states, will not really fully be protected until we actually deschedule. Descheduling is just removing marijuana from the controlled substance list, where it's currently a Schedule I drug, which is the harshest category to be in. And it's the most criminalized on the federal level on that schedule. It has reaches barriers, but on top of that, it means that even in legal states, non-citizens will still face or often be threatened with immigration-related consequences for even working legally in the industry or consuming cannabis or having a previous conviction. So, you know, there are limitations to federal advocacy, but they go hand in hand, what's happening in the states, what's happening on the federal level.
Give me an idea as to what it's been as far as a response from lawmakers when you really start tackling these issues, because we do know that many lawmakers, of course, because the bill passed, was in favor of the decriminalization of marijuana and the legalization of marijuana use. But when you talk about these other issues, sometimes you do get this pushback from a lot of lawmakers and legislators. What's been your encounter so far?
Yeah, so, you know, DPA convened the Marijuana Justice Coalition back in 2018. And with a lot of work, within 2 years, we were able to pass the first bill to actually end marijuana prohibition on the federal level. That was the MORE Act, the Marijuana Opportunity Reinvestment and Expungement Act. I think one of the biggest issues that I'm facing with policymakers in Congress, especially, is that folks think that supporting marijuana legalization means that's ending the war on drugs. Again, like, marijuana legalization is just scratching the surface. So there'll be policymakers who are like great on marijuana, but, you know, think that we should be harshly criminalizing fentanyl as a response to overdose, for example, or, you know, can't really see or understand why we actually should just stop jailing people for drugs, period. And I think the job of advocates at this point is to make sure that we can mobilize, you know, the support that we see around marijuana and extend that to all substances and really get policymakers a better understanding of the drug war broadly. You know, DPA released recently a report that we entitled Uprooting the Drug War. And it's a report that highlights the way that drug war policies and drug war mentality is actually infiltrating all systems, not just our criminal legal system. Our family regulation system is impacted by the drug war. Our housing system is impacted by the drug war. Until recently, when you're applying for financial aid, you have to check off whether or not you had a drug conviction. You know, the impact is so far reaching. So to just support marijuana legalization and thinking that you're actually ending the war on drugs is a fallacy. You know, so I think learning from the lessons of marijuana exceptionalism and learning from the lessons of our marijuana legalization efforts, we're really looking towards moving policymakers over to ending criminalizing drug possession broadly, because that's what's necessary. It's truly necessary to actually start to get at our really, again, terrifying overdose rates, in addition to an actual investment in harm reduction and access to healthcare, all of the social and economic needs that help stabilize lives. Those are the things that we need to focus on, not punishing people and stigmatizing people because they use drugs.
Yeah. So how can people get involved in, you know, being an advocate and supporting the work that you're doing?
I will say two things. One is on an individual and just a community level, really working to fight against stigma, even if it just comes down to our language. Language is really important, and that actually feeds into the systemic issues that we're dealing with. Drug stigma is real, and that really impacts our relationships, but also policy. So I think, you know, even if you can't wake up and become a drug policy reform lobbyist, you can in your community and within your own families push back against stigma, including stigmatizing language. But on the advocacy front, calling your members of Congress, calling your state and local representatives is a really important thing to do. I think folks under-realize how important like reaching out to your actual representatives are and how impactful it is, especially for advocates who are at the forefront of trying to move reform. It's critical that your representatives are hearing from you and hearing that this is what you want. You know, DPA and the ACLU actually recently released polling data, you know, around the anniversary of the war on drugs that shows that 65% of American voters, you know, support ending criminalizing people for drug possession and actually investing in public health approaches. And even higher than that, 83% of American voters believe that the war on drugs has failed. So this is something that, you know, there's not too many issues that most American voters actually can agree on. So, you know, I think it's critical that people realize their power, their people power, and demand that the representatives, you know, change and reform these drug policy laws.
Yeah. Well, Queen, it's been great having this conversation with you, and certainly we'll have to bring it back so that way we can get more updates as the legal calendar moves and we see the legislative, I should say, calendar moves, and we see how things are really being addressed. But thank you for your work, and thank you for sharing your perspective with us here.
Thank you for inviting me.
All righty. Well, I want to let our viewers know that we come to the end of our show today. We hope that you've definitely enjoyed this week's discussion on the social justice forums. I'm Daren Jaime. I want to tell you that if you want to find out more, catch the Recablecast here on BronxNet or always on our website at BronxNet.org. We invite you to come back next week. We'll have some new guests. We're going to elevate the discussion. We're going to promote some more civic engagement. And we're going to keep you informed on the issues that matter most here in New York City and most of all across the globe. Daren Jaime saying take care, and we'll see you soon on the Social Justice Forum.